my name is Andrea, and this is High Literature, a program where I introduce my friends, books, and comics to you, the viewer. So I've been doing a lot of comic book videos, and I miss books. That's something that I've noticed it's been happening. Hello, Bandy. I'll start doing a bunch of book videos, and then I will miss comics and do a bunch of comic videos and back and forth. And I'm thinking that sometime in the future I'll see about bringing the two together and figure out a way to correlate the two, because that is how it works in my head. I've never separated them. One's never felt better than the other or more important than the other. They just have always been on equal ground for me as far as love and importance. It was like having to pick one best friend over another. It just was not something that I was capable of doing. There are things that I like about comics better than books, and things that I like better about books than I do comics, but I couldn't pick one over the other. So I was thinking, instead of going back and forth between doing comic book videos and book videos, maybe at some point I'll do videos where I talk about both. But in the meantime, this is going to be a book focused video. I had this idea. I had picked up this very strange book. It's a book of short stories by Daphne du Maurier. Daphne du Maurier is probably best known for her book Rebecca, which is the story that inspired Alfred Hitchcock to make his first movie, Rebecca. And I have always wanted to read Rebecca. I've always wanted to read My Cousin Rachel. I've never read either. And when I found this book of short stories, I think I found this at the last bookstore in Los Angeles. I thought, well, this would be a perfect way to get into the world of Daphne du Maurier's writings. And the stories in here are really bizarre. There is this cool, don't you love when you find stuff like this? It's from January 1988. I'm guessing that's the initial Z. And I'll always wonder about it. It might be a 2. It might be saying this is a $2 book. I don't know. But we're going to pretend it's the initial Z because it's way more interesting. So this has 3, 6, 8 short stories in it, and the short story called The Pool, I haven't finished all of them, but The Pool so far is my favorite short story, and it put me on this thought path of how there are stories that I revisit because I am after a certain feeling. And this short story really reminded me of that. And I started thinking about how, are there other books, other stories that I do that with? And I thought of quite a few, but the main examples that I'm going to go over today we'll talk about The Pool by Daphne du Maurier, and Lord of the Flies by William Golding. And this copy, so the copy that I had originally, I bought when I was 12 at an airport bookstore, and it was that cover, of Ralph. It's just like this blonde-haired boy with like all these twigs and leaves stuck through his hair, and I was just so taken by that cover. And I read that paperback book so many times the pages were falling out of the spine, and I wish I still had it. It was something I treasured, but it got lost during a transcontinental shipping disaster where this idiot shipped my boxes of treasured books and graphic novels and notebooks, diaries, everything. They shipped these boxes of books. Boxes of books are heavy, with one strip of packing tape to seal the books. The fact that I got any boxes at all from California to Georgia is a miracle. But yeah, out of 14 boxes, I got 7. So 7 books, 7 boxes of books and comics, lost forever. Comics that my childhood best friend I had inherited after he died. My childhood diary gone. My copy of Lord of the Flies that I got when I was 12 gone. I mean, that's something that will just haunt me to my grave. And oh my God, if I could just, that person. Who does that? Who ships books with one strip? Anyway, so I bought this copy, and this copy, oh my God, it smells so good. It is very, very old. It is from 1955. So I'm guessing it's a first printing, because it doesn't say much in the way of really anything as far as, oh, this printing and that printing, this publishing date. This is from 1955. Sorry, 1959. I took off my glasses for the glare. But so yeah, Lord of the Flies, The Pool by Daphne du Maurier, and Drawing Blood by Poppy Z. Brite, who has for quite some time, they transitioned a long time ago, and they now go by Billy Martin. But oh, thank God I still have all my Poppy Z. Brite books. You can still see like my little inscription that I put in there. This is a retaped over. This was falling apart, and I took packaging tape and just taped over all. That's why it's shiny like that. But all 3 of these books share the qualities that I'm going to talk about. That reminded me of this whole idea when I read The Pool. And I wrote a little, I guess, breakdown of it. Just trying to organize my thoughts of how I feel about this whole thing. So I broke it down to outer, inner, and mystical. Outer is when there is no presence of introspective elements within the story. Character interactions are firmly rooted in reality. Everything is outwardly apparent, both to the characters in the story and the audience. And then there's inner, where the story is structured within realistic constraints, but the characters, as well as the general mood of the story itself, are pensive and withdrawn, existing on the fringes of reality by way of the character's imagination and innermost thoughts and feelings. And then there's mystical. Reality is not present in any way, shape, or form. This form of storytelling is typically presented as a dream state within the character's mind, otherworldly, an environment, or both. So for The Pool by Daphne du Maurier, the outer sections are the dialogue and interactions between Deborah and her brother and their grandparents. The inner parts of the story's writing is Deborah playing alone by the pool, lost in her own imagination. It's still daylight, her family is nearby, and she could be in their company at any given moment. Mystical is nighttime. Deborah is completely alone and utterly absorbed in her imagination to a point where she actually believes she has gone to another world via the pool. And then we have Lord of the Flies by William Golding. Such a good book. Outer are the conversations and activities amongst the boys. Inner are moments of solitary musings or even in group settings where everyone is quiet and absorbed in their own thoughts. Mystical would be Simon's encounter with the beast, the boys being so consumed by fear they believe the dead pilot to be the beast, or when Simon's body is carried away by the ocean, presented as an anti-beast, nature as God. And then with Drawing Blood, Poppy Z. Brite, now Billy Martin, the outer, again, are interactions, conversations between characters. The inner are inner musings and recalling memories. And then mystical is going to Birdland. And yeah. So going back to the beginning. So with the pool, this is a really interesting story and example of this structure of storytelling. So the outer parts with the dialogue and the interactions between Deborah and her brother and her grandparents, I really love that section of the story. It's about these two siblings. It's finally summer and they're visiting their grandparents, and it's, I guess, what people would call slice of life. It's just little bickerings between the siblings and talking to the grandparents about lunch and the weather and stuff like that. And throughout these little moments, there will be little segues that are more inner. And it's about Deborah just really being engaged with her own imagination. There's this part where she goes to a shed to get the pieces to play a game of cricket with her brother. And as she's gathering up the materials, a wooden clothing pin drops. And she starts to leave the shed, but then she feels guilty. And she thinks, oh my gosh, this clothing pin, it's going to be lonely and it's going to feel torn away from the rest of the wooden clothing pins. And she goes back and she takes the wooden clothing pin and she puts it back with the rest. And she's like, okay, I can play without feeling guilt or worried about that poor clothing pin being separated from all the other ones. And she doesn't really think that, but she kind of does. And it's just this little game that she plays with herself. And it's just really funny, and it's just like, this was written in the there are a lot of dates. I'm gonna say, for the sake of time, that this was published in the 50s. And it was just really neat to me. And I wonder, like, if there was a way to track that, at what are the fluctuations with people's imaginations and how they perceive, how they relate to inanimate objects. Like when you think about even today, the way Bob is in Bob's Burgers and how he talks to his spatula and stuff like that, people just have these weird, very emotional connections to inanimate objects. These, what you call it, they anthropomorphize it, and I just find it fascinating and really sentimental and tenderhearted. And then there's the other part of the story, the mystical, where you're just having a little ball, aren't you, Bandel? Bandel is my senior cat, and she's feeling kind of frisky right now. Hello. Hi. Hi, pumpkin. So yeah, the outer, we're just rooted in reality, conversations with everyday people doing everyday things, and then you go inner and you start being more in the character's imagination. At one point in time, she kind of separates from her brother and she goes for a walk, and she goes through like this whole like prayer ritual when she gets to the pool, and like appeases to like the gods of nature, and like makes this sacrifice with like this wooden pencil that she cherished and loved all throughout the school year. And at the same time, while she's having this inner experience, it doesn't take but a moment for all that to go away when her brother comes looking for her, or her grandmother rings the bell signaling lunchtime. And then we go to the mystical, and that's when she's completely alone. She wakes up in the middle of the night and she decides she's going to go to the pool. So she's completely by herself. There's no one there to interrupt her imaginings, and she just transports herself to this other world through the pool and interacts with all these like magical beings. And it's really strange. It's almost sinister in a way, and it's definitely spooky. It's Daphne du Maurier, so yeah, there's definitely spooky elements to it. And depending on my mood, I go to this short story for specific parts. I either want to read it because I just want that slice of life, easy, no drama, just easygoing reading about just the simple interactions between her and her brother, and the funny arguments they have. Like there's this one debate they get into about what are there more of, grains of sand or blades of grass. And it's just very soothing and relaxing. And then depending on my mood, I want to go a little bit deeper. And instead of reading just those simple everyday exchanges, I want to read about Deborah getting lost in her imagination by herself, playing in the woods and just playing pretend basically. And I don't go any further beyond that. I don't read the spooky stuff. I'll play a little bit with the more outer stuff, but the focus is definitely on the inner musings and her having her own inner dialogue and pretending that she's interacting with nature gods and spirits and stuff. And then again, depending on my mood, I will go to the story to read only the parts about when she is alone and we are not in the real world anymore and we are just transported to a different time and place, all through her imagination. And then once in a while, I'll just read the story as a whole and enjoy it as one piece. But yeah, it made me wonder, like, do other people do this? I'm sure there must be. I remember the first time I came across this particular way of reading. I was really young and was, like most girls in the 90s, just obsessed with the Babysitter's Club. And I really identified with Claudia and Marianne the most. And Marianne was having this really bad day, and she decided to cheer herself up by reading the part in Little Women where Beth dies, thinking that, at least my sister's not dying, and I'll read about this terrible thing that are happening to these fictional people, even though it is, fiction. You know what I mean. We don't have to get into the whole Alcott story. We can do that in another video. I love the Alcott story. But I just thought that was so interesting. I was definitely in elementary school at the time, and I had just never, like, reading for me was just something that I did. I did it for fun. I did it to escape. I did it to just enjoy a good story, but it wasn't something that I did specifically because I was in a bad mood and I wanted to cheer myself up by reading something crappy that was happening to somebody else. I thought that was so odd. And I guess that's still not exactly what I'm doing in these instances. But with that being said, I'm sure that there are people out there who will pick up a book, not because they're reading a story from beginning to end, but because they've read it multiple times before and they're going to revisit a particular part for a specific feeling for whatever reason or mood they're in at that moment. And it made me wonder, what are other books, what are other stories that people do that with, and why? And if it would fit this structure of inner, outer, and mystical. Moving on, I felt another great example of this is Lord of the Flies. I did that with this book a lot. I think I've sat and read through this book as many times as I've gone back to just read specific parts depending on what mood I was in. For the outer, I really loved reading about just the simple everyday goings-ons with the kids trying to build shelter or scavenging for fruit. And a lot of it it's such a sad story, and a scary story, that I would read those parts kind of to just reassure myself that it wasn't all bad, that there were moments where they were just young kids having a good time on a deserted island. And they were just those parts were just little small snippets of the story. And I treasured those parts, and I would just revisit those parts over and over again and just read about the good times. And then when you go to inner, those are the parts where like they decide, after they kind of get organized and they decide to go exploring the island. And so they're all together, it's a group of them. So some of them go, and then some of them stay to look after the younger kids. And this like troop of boys that go off to explore the island, they are all together, but there's something sacred about what they're doing. And they're all quiet, and nobody's really talking with each other. They're all just kind of lost in their own worlds. And even though they're not interacting with each other or having conversations, they all have this innate, this shared sense of camaraderie, this shared feeling and appreciation of adventure and exploring and wandering around this island. And it's kind of scary, but it's fun, and they're all just, lost in their own thoughts and feelings. And that parts like that gave me that inner feeling where it's not just outwardly just rooted in reality. It's not completely mystical. We're talking about like other spirits, other worlds, but it's like hovering in between. Like we're existing on the fringes of their imagination. And then we have the mystical part where things get kind of weird. And like the part where Simon has that terribly spooky conversation with the beast in the form of the boar's head that Jack impaled on a stake. God, that part just disturbed me so much as a kid. Like, what sadistic person does that? It still freaks me out to this day. And then, and then later on, they're so wrapped up in their fear, and they're so convinced that there is a monster on the island, that when the parachutist who just happens to land on the island after his plane gets shot down, his corpse and the parachute gets tangled up in the trees, and they convince themselves that that's a monster. And even though we know better, the way it's written, they don't know, and so it may as well be a monster. And it's that's gives it, that mystical sense, that otherworldliness. We're not in reality anymore. We're dealing with monsters now. And then that really crazy scene after Simon dies, and his body gets taken by the ocean. And it's so sad, and it's so beautiful. And I remember I'd read it over and over and over again as a kid, and just not really having any idea what was going on. But I didn't care. It was just so cool to me that even though I didn't understand what was going on, I still had an appreciation for just the magic of it. And when I revisit this story now, it just hits so much harder. And it's actually been a while since I've read this all the way through. I just get so emotional, I'm not able to finish it. But I do want to revisit this again as a whole instead of in sections like I've been doing. And then last but not least, Drawing Blood, Poppy Z. Brite, now Billy Martin. This book is so stinking cool. I want to say it came out in The Greatest Year Ever, 1994. Let's see if I'm right. 1993. Very close, very close. This book is about a cartoonist named Trevor Black, and he is coming back to his hometown in an attempt to find out the origins of his existence, because he spent pretty much his whole life growing up in an orphanage after his famous cartoonist father, who later just wasn't able to produce work anymore, went crazy and murdered his whole family, but spared Trevor. And it was something that Trevor always, just kind of tortured himself over, why me? Why was I left alive? And so he goes back to the house that has been abandoned this whole time. Nobody would ever buy it, and tries to find out what happened. And so it's definitely a ghost story. It's definitely a haunted house story, but there are other elements to it that it's not purely a ghost story. There's so much going on in this book. It takes place in this tiny little fictional town in North Carolina. And the way it's written, the time that it was written, it just reminded me so much of my hometown. Just this tiny little hometown in the deep south, kudzu everywhere, and a mix of people that are either just weird and artistic and musical, or dull and cruel and racist and bigoted. And it just, like, reading this book, aside from the family getting murdered, a lot of it felt like reading about my own life and my friends and my hometown. And as I've said in other videos, I really love reading books or comics that either introduce you to new musicians or new movies or new artists, or talk about those things that you already are familiar with, and it just feels like a affirmation that, yeah, you're into cool things. There are a lot of references to Nine Inch Nails and William S. Burroughs and Patsy Cline and Robert Crumb, and I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. And it just, reading this book every single time, it felt like I was hanging out with an old friend. So the outer parts, again, are just the everyday conversations, the everyday interactions with the people and the characters in the story. They're so fun, they're so cool, there's so many interesting characters and the things that they do. There's Terry Bucket, the record store owner of the Whirling Disc, who is also in a band, and it talks about the record store and how, like, there was this new employee that misordered this terrible record, and so Terry would torture him with it, playing it constantly over and over and over again. And there's Kinsey Hummingbird, who was a mechanic for a long time, and after a family tragedy, took the money that he inherited to open the first club in the town, and would host bands, and was kind of like a father figure to a lot of the wayward kids. And he just took a lot of happiness from being able to feed them and give them like a place of sanctuary to go to, and be able to enjoy music and spend time with their friends outside of school and family. And I just loved reading about these characters and their little lives. And then we have the inner, where we go into the inner musings and the imagination of Trevor. And then there's this other main character, Zach, who is on the run from the FBI. He's from New Orleans, and he has this best friend, Eddie Sung, who I just was in love with because she was this really cool, like, punk rocker, half Korean chick. And you just don't see many characters like that in stories. So whenever I see, I come across one, I'm just like, yay! So I loved Eddie Sung. And she was just, God, I love her in this story. And Dougal St. Clair, another friendly freak from the French Quarter in New Orleans, and Eddie and Dougal get together to like try and save Zach, who ends up in the fictitious town of Missing Mile, North Carolina, and meets Trevor. And it's just, these two people, one that grew up in an orphanage, very withdrawn, very, just keeps to himself, has this terrible family history, so he's not very giving with sharing anything about his life. And then you have Zach, who, being on the run from the FBI, isn't exactly sharing either, and they end up finding each other. And what happens, I'm not going to tell you. You really need to read the book. It's so good. But yeah, there are so many parts where you're just kind of in the person's imagination. And then we have